Good morning. I've had a rough morning, if you can't tell from the hair, but I wanted to go ahead and put together a video about this phenomenon, science of the gaps, specifically how it relates to the current, I don't know, infatuation in science with this multiverse theory. So I guess we'll go ahead and crack on. So before I explain how I think the new multiverse theory that's being peddled is a science of the gaps, I want to go ahead and go back and see where we get the problem of science of the gaps. It really comes from sort of a intellectual fallacy known as God of the gaps, which is when a theist will argue that because some portion of the universe is not completely explained, then it is owed, the existence of that phenomenon is owed to God. It is sort of directly generated by God. And when the problem with this is that when science does eventually explain the phenomenon, then it weakens the theist case because it's been unnecessarily wedded to this natural phenomenon. Good examples of the God of the gaps. If you go back to antiquity, before people understood the water table, or like how evaporation works, they would say that there was a god who controlled the weather, who made it rain or thunder, or so on and so forth. And now we know, of course, that the sun causes water to evaporate, and it creates the water cycle. We know all this. So that's a primitive example of God of the gaps. A more recent example is the fossil record. There were a lot of people when the fossil record was discovered who said essentially that these fossils have been placed here by God for whatever purpose. Some people said that dinosaur fossils were placed on the earth by God to test their faith. But when the theory of evolution was posited and was taken widely accepted to be the reason for these fossils being here, then it weakened the theist case because they had unnecessarily wedded it to this natural phenomenon. But then, how does this relate to the science of the gaps? Well, the science of the gaps, put most succinctly, is essentially the idea that some phenomenon, and usually it's a supernatural or at least non-ordinary phenomenon, that all of them will be explained by science, and that there is no room for a creator God. So it assumes a priori that there is no God. It makes this assumption, and then it builds upon this assumption by then saying that there must be a scientific explanation because we have already assumed that God does not exist, or that supernatural forces do not exist. So the way that the science of the gaps is different than the God of the gaps, naturally there are two ways. One is that a science of the gaps argument is not strictly falsifiable. And this is I think part of the strength of the science of the gaps is that if you take God of the gaps arguments, they're almost always falsifiable because of the relation of theological truth to scientific truth. However, another way that they're different is that the science of the gaps argument relies on the assumption that all knowledge is scientific. A interesting version of the science of the gaps is that some people, and this is generally not scientists, because most scientists understand the boundaries of their field and how it is limited. But some people, for instance, think that there's such a thing as a scientific morality, sort of a objectively right way of doing things that can be revealed to us by science. This is a science of the gaps argument. It's not strictly falsifiable because I can't say, I mean, I can say that, there is no such thing as a scientific morality, but it's not strictly falsifiable in the sense that I can point it out as being obviously absurd if someone doesn't take my premises first, right? That God is the seat of morality, or if you don't have a deity, you can't have an objective morality. So there's that. And so I want to talk about how the well, first I want to talk about the multiverse theory that's been so popular recently, and I think it's also akin to the simulation theory for the universe. So scientists these days have been put in a bit of a pickle, I think, because of the success of the fine-tuning argument. Is they look at the universe and they see that the way that the four fundamental forces, for example, are balanced. That's the electromagnetism, gravity, the strong force, and the weak force, the strong and weak nuclear force. They see how they're balanced in the universe, and they see, just how the whole thing comes together to create a planet like Earth that, and Earth's position is so, prime that it seems relatively unlikely that this would happen by accident. So they're put in a real problem because the design of the universe would seem, or sorry, the product of the universe would seem to be designed specifically to harbor life. So they're in a real bind because that would necessitate a creator. So the whole point in theoretical physics, I wouldn't say the whole point of theoretical physics, but a lot of people in theoretical physics want to disprove or say that we don't need a creator God. Stephen Hawking, for example, just posited that the universe can just be. It doesn't need to be caused. That was his argument. It's overall unconvincing. So to get around that problem, we have two theories. One, that the universe is a simulation created by advanced intelligences, in which case, we're not really real, we're computer programs and what have you. This would technically explain the fine-tuning argument. It would explain it away. What it wouldn't explain is that then okay, at some point you get to a universe. Like, let's say that we're a simulation in a simulation. You keep going and going and going. At some point you get to, quote unquote, the real universe. And that universe would have had to have beings like us who are, I don't know, just as advanced as us and had the same opportunities as us to become an advanced civilization and therefore to evolve like we did. So their universe would have had similar circumstances to ours, and so you get back to the fine-tuning argument in the real universe, is that this civilization had to arise somehow. So you still end up with the seeming necessity for a creator. The multiverse theory, which is different, it essentially states, and it has to do with inflation, the way that the universe is constantly expanding. The theory is that as the universe expands, it creates little pocket universes that then break off and form their own universes, and this apparently goes on ad infinitum. And this would also explain away the fine-tuning argument, because then you could say, out of the millions and millions, trillions, billions, however many actual universes there are, that the fact that our universe happens to be fine-tuned for our existence could just be an accident, because there are billions of universes. Okay, that's true. That if the multiverse theory is correct, then that would be a logical step from there. I would say it still doesn't explain how you have to, at some point you trace back causality, and you have to arrive at some point where there was just one universe, and that one universe had to have come from somewhere. I don't think the steady state theory, even at a multiversal scale, makes any sense, that things just sort of happen to be. But anyway, that's not what I wanted to get onto for today. The thing about the multiverse theory that makes it so attractive if you're trying to explain away the existence of a creator is that it's completely it's completely unfalsifiable, because in order to prove this theory, you would have to get to if you were trying to disprove this theory or prove it, you would have to get to the universal membrane, or whatever is at the edge of the universe, and you would have to attempt to step into another universe and then come back and report your success, which by our current laws of physics is impossible. It's sort of like string theory. There was a theory, there still is a theory in physics that all the universe is made up, even at the very, very, very small, infinitesimally small level, are made up of these little strings that vibrate, and that's what creates matter and energy. The problem, again, with this theory is that it's completely non-falsifiable, because the strings are, by their very definition, too small to be observed. It's the same sort of thing. It's impossible to observe this phenomenon, so it's impossible to say that it's not true, because we can't observe it. However, we can say it seems unlikely. It seems like something that was invented to explain away certain phenomenon that scientists don't want to deal with, which is my argument entirely. And another thing, right? So you can see how this multiverse theory assumes that there can be no creator. It assumes within itself that the universe has to have some naturalistic genesis. And so it has to create this theory of these multiple universes that all generate themselves in order to satisfy its requirement for a non-supernatural genesis. All right. So whenever you encounter this multiverse argument, I want you to think very clearly about the fact that it's essentially a God of the gaps argument, but for scientists. So it's sort of an anti-God of the gaps argument. And I wouldn't go as far as to say it's intellectually dishonest, but I would say that I would exercise caution when reading theoretical physics and announcements in theoretical physics in the future. And just keep in mind that a lot of these people have an interest, not even the people who come up with the theories maybe, but the people who spin them to the public, have an interest in pushing this naturalistic genesis of the universe by whatever means they can. All right. Well, this has been the Hidebound Convivium. Thank you for watching.